Hello and welcome to this video on a parasitic profile of the horsehair worm. Now, unlike other parasites such as children, gold diggers, or cougar hunters, the horsehair worm actually is, well, natural. And natural in terms of it's something that we can understand in nature, not having to worry about encountering it as part of society, which does make studying it far less ethically fraught. Nematomorpha belongs to the kingdom Animalia, and within this we have the Ecdysozoa. This then has molting animals like nematodes and arthropods, arthropods being crabs and to an extent spiders. Within that again we have the group Nematoida. Alongside nematodes, roundworms, we have a close evolution relationship under the broader Cycloneuralia. In short, it's part of a big family that's existed for a long time. The horsehair worm, as a member of its phyla, was formally established in 1886 by a name we're not even going to try and pronounce. It was divided into two main classes. Gordioida, this class encompasses the majority of species, somewhere about 320 to 351 freshwater and terrestrial forms, and then into that again, the families Goida and Corodidae. They primarily parasitize insects and other terrestrial arthropods. Nectomidia, or as it's also sometimes spelt, Nectonematoida, are a smaller monotypic class within the genus Nectomina. There are 5 marine species which parasitize decapod crustaceans, like crabs. Recent taxonomic studies, such as those using sequencing of DNA for the most part, although there are some other approaches, on tiny species like Coroides forminosa, Acodotalanesis, and Godis chiamus, we give up on these, have refined the species delimitation by revealing that there are very high interest-specific genetic diversity without clear geographic or host-based structuring. This suggests effective gene flow on potential cryptic species. New species continue to be described, such as the Gordius solanensis from Indonesia and Gordionus maori from New Zealand, which basically tells us that we don't know enough about these creatures, we don't know where they are or what they're doing, and allows ongoing discoveries in what are described as underexplored regions, which may or may not be a good thing. Okay, that's enough of the scientific nonsense. Let's look at what actually this thing does and how it looks. Morphologically, horsehair worms exhibit a simple, elongated body plan. Superficially, it mimics nematodes, but it lacks cilia and certain distinct internal features distinguish it from the nematodes. Adults typically measure somewhere between 5 and 10 centimeters in length. This is 2 to 4 inches or thereabouts, and in extreme cases they can get up to 2 meters in length. This is just shy of 7 feet, or thereabouts. In terms of diameter, they're only 0.3 to 3 millimeters. This is 1/8 to 1/80th of an inch. They have a blunt head, their slightly swollen tail, and they should be fairly uniform featureless exterior. The colour is a purplish-brown colour, black and occasionally white, which does make figuring out whether or not this thing is a nematode, a horsehair worm, or something else slightly more difficult. Their cuticle, which is the tough outer skin of a kind, is, well, tough and non-ciliated. It's composed of collagen-like proteins, and they only possess longitudinal muscles for movement. This means the only way they can move, and more accurately, move forwards, is by whipping or thrashing. They're like a toddler throwing a fit, except unlike a toddler who's throwing a fit for a ridiculous reason, they actually have a semi-rational purpose. Internally, the nematomorphs have a reduced anatomy. That is to say, they are really simple organisms. They have a non-functional gut. Adults do not feed. Instead, they rely on reserves accumulated during their parasitic phase. They don't excrete because, well, excretion requires that they have some sort of digestion system. They have a very fundamental respiratory system and circulatory system, although not in any context you would understand it compared to a more complex organism. They also have a very basic nervous system with a nerve ring at the anterior end and a ventral nerve cord. Reproduction is, well, using their gonads, and they do actually have gonads. They're cylindrical and open into a cloaca. Now this is some sort of weird penis and chicken egg laying thing, but that gives you an understanding of what sort of structures we're talking about. The larvae, let's call them, are more complex, and they feature rings of cuticular hooks and terminal stylets. These are for penetrating hosts. They need to stay where they are, and the idea is basically to use these hooks to, well, remain where they are. Gordoidians have a single ventral epidermal cord and a mesenchyme-filled blastocell that becomes spacious with age. The nematocids feature double rows of natatory setae for swimming and a dorsal ventral epidermal cord. What distinguishes the horsehair from similar nematodes, the merthamid kind of nematode, is the terminal cloaca, thicker cuticle with areoles, and darker coloration. The life cycle of your horsehair worm consists of 4 distinct stages: egg, pre-parasitic larvae, parasitic larvae, and free-living adult. The egg stage is the first, because it kinda has to be. It does also somewhat arguably answer the question of which came first, chicken or the egg. The egg stage is the adult female lays millions of minute ovate eggs, about 40 to 50 microns in size, in a long gelatinous string in water. Fertilization occurs internally, and the eggs develop over a period of 7 to 14 days. Then we have the pre-parasitic larvae stage. Hatching larvae are semi-sessile. They're equipped with hooks and stylets. They survive for up to 2 weeks before they find a host to infect, typically via ingestion, although there are other mechanisms, and this is done when a host, say, drinks contaminated water. Some species will use an intermediate host, these are called paratenic hosts, like aquatic insects or snails, for encystment before reaching the final or definitive host. Whilst they're, let's say, alive still in their larval stage, we get the parasitic larval stage. This is the time they spend inside the host's body. This is also called the host's hemocoel or body cavity. The larvae will absorb nutrients through its skin. It'll grow over weeks to possibly months and undergoes several molts. These are called edsices. This stage disrupts the host development, reproduction, and often leads to the host's death upon emergence. Now, in the case of humans, not necessarily as much because we are typically somewhat more significantly sized and somewhat more able to cope, but it can happen. This brings us to the adult stage of the horsehair worm. Mature worms emerge when the host enters water, typically killing it. This is, not ideal for the host, but for the horsehair worm, it's great, because the adults are now free-living. They will aggregate for mating, forming what are called Gordian knots, and what we would just describe as the pile given South Park. The adults do not feed, which makes sense, again, no digestive tract, but they will survive on stored energy for a short period before they reproduce and die. Like most living organisms, their sole objective in life is sex. Well, sex in the form of reproduction. Once they've achieved that, their life is fulfilled and they are willing to just pass on. Now, this cycle typically takes 2 to 3 months, and there are some examples of them overwintering in soil or debris, particularly in temperate regions. The ecology and habitat are, kind of obvious from what we've described. Horsehair worms inhabit damp environments worldwide. They need water. This does include streams, ponds, puddles, watering troughs, swimming pools, and even semi-terrestrial areas like moist soil. Gordoidians are predominantly freshwater or terrestrial, but there are some that can live in marine or essentially saltwater. These are nectominids. The effect of horsehair worms is that they influence riparian ecosystems and they will alter certain host behavior. For instance, host orthopterians, grasshoppers, crickets, etc., become significantly and up to 20 times more likely to enter streams, providing up to 60% of the energy intake for fish, like char in Japan. In subtropical regions, mantids are key hosts, while in other areas beetles, cockroaches, and millipedes predominate. The distribution is tied to water availability, with about 11 species in the US and hotspots in regions like Taiwan and New Zealand offering refuge for large populations. In terms of behavior and host manipulation, we've kind of touched on this already, but as parasites, horsehair worms are masters of behavioral manipulation. Species like the Spinocordoides talini and Paragordius tricuspidatus infect the host's brain, and this alters neural pathways to compel terrestrial hosts, grasshoppers, mantids, etc., to seek out and enter water, effectively drowning themselves. The horsehair worm causes certain species to self-delete in an effort to be able to reproduce. This mind control of a kind involves mimicking the host neurotransmitters or acquiring genes via horizontal gene transfer from the host genome. They steal genes to try and manipulate your brain into thinking, you know what, that water looks really nice now, how about you spend some time in there? And then die. In mantids, like the Hirodula patiphylla, worms will modify light perception to attract hosts to polarize water reflections. Yeah, Narcissus had it one way, and thankfully he was not infected with horsehair worms, but given the time he spent staring into shiny objects, maybe we're wrong. Adults exhibit gregarious behavior, forming tangled masses during mating, and some species, like Paragordius tricuspidatus, can escape predators after host consumption. Evolutionary aspects are more exciting and more terrifying, mostly based on recent studies. Nematomorphs diverged early in the Cambrian period. This is when we basically had the explosion of life on Earth and diversity of different life forms occurring. These ones found their niche fairly quickly and have stayed there for the last 100 million years or so. A 2023 genomic study has revealed that horsehair worms have lost about 30% of the typical animal genes, and most of these are related to cilia development, about 200. These are structures intended for sensing what's going on in the environment around the horsehair worm and allowing for movement in most eukaryotes. This loss is shared across freshwater and marine species, and appears to have occurred in some sort of common ancestor. That does, however, pose a puzzle. How the hell do they navigate without their cilia? Because you kind of need something to move, and recent comparative genomics on species like the Actogordius australiensis show that the genome has adapted for parasitism, allowing them to be able to move to some extent. The genome is somewhere in the ballpark of 200 to 300 megabase pairs. Population studies in Taiwan using barcoding with the COX-1 and DNA sequencing indicate panmixia. That's basically random mating in species like C. fulmensis, with demographic shifts tied to the Pleistocene climate changes. This has emphasized the need for multi-locus approaches in conservation genetics. Other research has confirmed the absence of symbiotic bacteria, which has helped to debunk some earlier assumptions about how they live and get by. This brings us to human interactions and economic importance. Horsehair worms occasionally infect vertebrates, mostly accidentally, but that does include humans, for example, contaminated water. But they cause no harm as they can't complete their cycle and are mostly expelled out of the body. Economically, their impact is relatively minor. They can reduce insect populations. For example, they can kill up to 99% of those that are infected in some areas, which can potentially benefit agriculture by controlling pests like grasshoppers, but infections are also sporadic and, well, introducing a parasitic organism like this to an area and saying, hey, it's to protect our crops, is generally frowned upon. Mostly horsehair worms are a parasitic curiosity. They can be found in livestock troughs from, say, drowned hosts, but they also inspired folklore about, animated horsehair worms. In research, they're more often used as a model for parasitoid evolution and host manipulation, but that's about the extent of their, use. Not to say they aren't incredibly interesting, and of course, as mentioned, they have significance given their wide presence, the nature of how they affect hosts and everything else, but as far as humans go, they're kind of weird as a curiosity, but that's it, they're a curio. Thankfully, they're not a danger. Exactly. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.